Have you ever paused in your garden, not just to admire the leaves and flowers, but to think about the living world working quietly beneath your feet? Welcome back to Earthly Delights. Today, we are stepping into one of the simplest yet most powerful ideas in natural gardening, an approach that can change the way you see soil, kitchen waste, and the hidden life that keeps plants strong. We're talking about a method that feels almost too easy at first, but once you understand it, it makes perfect sense. A thriving garden does not always need bags of commercial fertilizer, synthetic chemicals, or costly soil boosters. In many healthy gardens, the real work is being done by a small, tireless workforce living right in the soil. That is exactly what today's topic is about. What these worms do will transform your garden. In-bed vermicomposting. If traditional composting has ever felt complicated, slow, messy, or unpleasant, this method may be the missing link. Instead of managing a separate compost pile or worm bin, we bring the worms directly into the garden bed, where they can turn food scraps into rich fertility right where plant roots need it most. Done properly, this can help reduce kitchen waste, save money, improve soil structure, and build a bed that is full of life from the inside out. In this video, we'll walk through 8 essential steps to understand and use in-bed vermicomposting with confidence. So get comfortable, stay with me, and let's dig into the soil together. CII-1, the paradigm shift. Why in-bed vermicomposting? Let's begin with a simple but important question. Why do we keep trying to force nature to work our way, when we could invite nature to do the heavy lifting for us? Traditional vermicomposting, or using worms to break down organic waste, usually means keeping worms in a separate plastic bin. You feed them there, wait a few months, harvest the castings, and then carry that rich compost back out to the garden. It works, and many gardeners have used it successfully. But let's be honest, it adds several extra steps, and for some people, it becomes one more chore to manage. In-bed vermicomposting changes the whole idea. Instead of raising worms somewhere else and moving the finished compost later, we place the system directly inside the garden bed. Think of it as a small, continuous fertility station built right into the soil. The worms live where the plants are growing, eat the kitchen scraps you add, and leave their nutrient-rich castings exactly where the roots can reach them. There is no heavy harvesting, no hauling buckets of compost across the yard, and no wasted effort. It becomes a steady, low-waste cycle of fertility. We are not only feeding the plants, we are building a living soil system right around the root zone. And in my experience, once you learn to work with that natural cycle of growth, decay, and renewal, gardening starts to feel far less like a battle and much more like a partnership. 6-on-2, meet your new garden workforce. Now, before you go digging up every earthworm you see after a rainstorm, we need to talk about the right workers for this job. Not all worms behave the same way, and not all of them are suited for composting food scraps in a garden bed. Many native earthworms are deep burrowing or soil-dwelling worms. They move through mineral soil, open channels, improve aeration, and help loosen compacted ground. They are valuable in the garden, but they are not the main workers we want for this system. For vermicomposting, we need surface-dwelling worms. These are worms that naturally live in decaying leaves, old plant matter, and rich organic layers near the surface. The most trusted choices are red wigglers, Eisenia foetida, and European nightcrawlers, Eisenia hortensis. Red wigglers are especially famous because they are powerful composters. Under good conditions, they can eat up to about half their body weight in food each day. They also reproduce quickly, and when their environment is moist, well-fed, and comfortable, their population can grow fast within just a few months. Because these worms do not naturally burrow deep into hard mineral soil, a dedicated feeding zone inside the garden bed gives them exactly what they need. They stay close to the food, close to the moisture, and close to the organic bedding. In return, they process kitchen waste efficiently and keep turning it into fertility right where your plants can benefit from it. 6-3, building the subterranean sanctuary. Now let's talk about building their home. The good news is that this does not need to be complicated or expensive. You can buy a ready-made, in-ground composter, but a simple homemade version can work very well if it gives the worms enough space, air, and contact with the surrounding soil. Some gardeners try using a narrow 4-inch PVC pipe, but that usually creates problems. The space is too tight, the oxygen is limited, and there is not enough horizontal area for a healthy worm population. When food scraps are packed into a narrow tube without enough airflow, the system can quickly turn sour, wet, and smelly instead of becoming a healthy composting zone. A better choice is a standard 5-gallon, or about 20-liter, bucket. Drill plenty of holes around the lower half and across the bottom, using holes around 1/2 inch, or 8 to 12 millimeters wide. If possible, use a step bit so the edges are cleaner and less likely to leave sharp plastic burrs. These holes allow worms, moisture, microbes, and nutrients to move between the bucket and the garden soil. Next, dig a hole in your garden bed and bury the bucket so only the top 2 to 3 inches remain above the soil surface. That raised edge helps keep soil from falling inside and makes it easier to open, feed, and manage. Before adding worms, prepare their bedding. This bedding is their shelter, moisture buffer, and resting zone. Add about 5 inches of damp, shredded cardboard, newspaper, or coconut coir to the bottom of the bucket. The moisture should feel like a wrung-out sponge, not dripping wet, but clearly damp. Then add your red wigglers. For most home garden beds, about 1/2 pound to 1 pound is a good starting amount. After that, give them a few days to settle into their new environment before adding the first real feeding. A calm start helps the worms adjust, and once they are comfortable, the whole system begins working much more smoothly. Section 4. Setting the table. The culinary art of feeding. Now we come to one of the most important parts of keeping a worm tower healthy, feeding it correctly. And the first question is simple. What do worms actually want to eat? The key is balance. A good worm system needs a steady mix of nitrogen-rich materials and carbon-rich materials. In practical terms, the greens are things like fruit and vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, and fresh grass clippings. These bring moisture and nutrients. The browns are shredded cardboard, dry autumn leaves, paper egg cartons, and similar dry materials. These are just as important as the food scraps because they absorb extra moisture, reduce odors, create airflow, and give the worms a comfortable place to live. A useful target is a carbon to nitrogen balance of around 20 to 1. You do not need to measure it perfectly every time, but you should always remember this rule. When in doubt, add more browns. Dry carbon materials solve many common worm bin problems before they even begin. Also, chop your food scraps into smaller pieces when you can. Worms do not have teeth, so they depend on microbes to soften and break down the food first. Smaller pieces decompose faster, which means the worms can process them more efficiently. And always bury the greens under a thick layer of browns. This one habit helps prevent fruit flies, bad smells, and unwanted pests. There are also foods you should avoid. Do not add meat, dairy, or oily foods because they rot quickly and can attract rats, raccoons, and other animals. Be careful with onions, garlic, and citrus as well. Citrus peels contain D-limonene, which can irritate the worm's sensitive bodies, and onions release sulfur compounds that can disturb the good bacteria your worm system depends on. 65. The Symphony of Soil Life. Now let's slow down and appreciate what is actually happening inside that buried bucket. When you place an apple core or vegetable peel into the worm tower, the worms are not simply biting into it like we would. First, bacteria and fungi begin breaking that food down. They soften it, transform it, and create the microbial layer that worms truly feed on. That is why a healthy worm tower is not just about worms. It is a living partnership between worms, microbes, moisture, air, and organic matter. As the worms process this material, they produce castings that are rich, dark, and biologically active. These castings contain valuable compounds such as humic and fulvic acids, along with nutrients like nitrates, phosphorus, calcium, and natural plant-supporting substances. Gardeners often call this material black gold, and for good reason. But the real strength of in-bed vermicomposting is what happens beyond the bucket itself. Because the tower holds moisture, food, and concentrated organic material, It becomes a powerful attraction point for the soil life already living nearby. Native earthworms from the surrounding bed can move into the feeding zone, share in the decomposing material, and then travel back out through the garden soil. As they move, they carry beneficial microbes, open small channels, and improve the movement of air and water through the bed. Those tunnels help roots breathe better and allow the soil to function more like a living sponge. Over time, the garden bed becomes more active, more structured, and more alive. It is not just soil holding plants in place anymore. It becomes a working, breathing system where waste is recycled into fertility again and again. Siskine 6, beating the elements, the resilient garden. Of course, every gardener knows that nature is not always gentle. Summer can bring intense heat, and winter can bring freezing cold. So what happens to the worms when the weather turns extreme? The good news is that a buried worm tower has a built-in advantage. Because the bucket sits down in the soil, the earth around it acts like insulation. It helps buffer the temperature and protects the worms far better than an exposed container sitting above ground. Red wigglers do best in a comfortable range of about 55 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit, or roughly 15 to 25 degrees Celsius. When summer gets hot, the worms naturally move toward the cooler, deeper parts of the bucket and surrounding soil. During very hot periods, you can also freeze some of your food scraps before adding them. As they thaw, they bring a little cooling relief and moisture into the system. Winter requires a different approach. In colder climates, just before the first hard freeze, add about 4 to 6 inches of food waste to the bin, then cover it with a thick layer of dry autumn leaves or mulch and put the lid on. As the food breaks down, it can create a small amount of gentle heat, while the mulch helps hold that warmth in. Even if some adult worms do not survive a severe winter, the system is often not lost. Worms leave behind cocoons, tiny egg capsules that can remain viable for a long time under the right conditions. When temperatures rise again in spring, those cocoons can hatch, and the worm population begins rebuilding. That is one of the most encouraging parts of working with living soil systems. When we give nature the right shelter, moisture, and food, it often finds a way to recover. Sign 7. Troubleshooting the unwanted guests. Now, let's be practical. Even a good worm tower can fall out of balance from time to time. If you open it and suddenly see unwanted insects or notice a strange smell, don't panic. In a living system, pests are often signals. They are telling you that moisture, airflow, food, or bedding needs adjustment. If fruit flies are swarming around the tower, the most common reason is exposed food scraps. Fruit flies love open, moist scraps sitting near the surface. The fix is simple. Every time you feed the worms, cover the food with a 3 to 4 inch layer of dry bedding, such as shredded cardboard, dry leaves, or paper material. You can also place a small trap nearby using apple cider vinegar with a drop of dish soap to reduce the adults while you correct the cause. If you see ants moving in, that usually means the bin is too dry. Ants prefer drier conditions, while worms need steady moisture. Add water slowly until the bedding feels like a wrung-out sponge again, damp but not soggy. If you notice many tiny reddish-brown mites, or the bin starts smelling sour and rotten like vinegar, that usually points to too much moisture, too much acidity, and not enough oxygen. Stop feeding for a while. Mix in a generous amount of dry, shredded cardboard and let the system breathe. A worm tower is a conversation with nature. When you learn to read the signs and adjust carbon, moisture, and airflow, balance usually returns quickly. Sifgyeon 8. The golden harvest and continuous transformation. Now we come to the reward for all that hidden work. How do we actually benefit from the worms, microbes, and organic matter quietly working below the surface? The best part of in-bed vermicomposting is that you do not have to harvest anything if you do not want to. As the worms process the food scraps, and as water moves through the tower, soluble nutrients slowly seep into the surrounding soil. The roots of tomatoes, peppers, squash, and many other crops can grow toward that rich zone and take advantage of the fertility being created right there in the bed. A single well-managed worm tower can support a surprisingly large section of garden because it is not just holding compost. It is creating a steady feeding point inside the soil. That is what makes this method so useful for gardeners who want fertility without constant hauling, mixing, and spreading. But if you do want to collect some of that dark, crumbly black gold for potted plants or seedlings, it is easy. Open the lid and gently remove the top layer where the fresh food and active worms are working. Set that aside. Then reach into the lower part of the bucket and scoop out the finished castings, dark, earthy smelling, and rich. After that, return the active top layer, add fresh bedding, and let the cycle continue. That is the beauty of this system. We are not simply getting rid of kitchen scraps. We are turning waste into soil life, reducing the need for synthetic petroleum-based fertilizers, saving money, and helping rebuild the living topsoil that supports healthy plants. Ooh, Ro. So now the question is simple. Are you ready to let the worms do part of the work for you? Are you ready to turn an ordinary garden bed into a more active, fertile, connected living system? This weekend, try starting small. Find a bucket, drill the holes, save some coffee grounds and vegetable scraps, and build your first in-bed worm sanctuary. Once you see how quietly and steadily the system works, you may never look at kitchen waste or garden soil the same way again. Your plants will benefit, your soil will improve, and you will feel that deeper satisfaction that comes from working with nature instead of constantly pushing against it. If today's guide helped you, please like the video, subscribe to Earthly Delights, and share it with another gardener who would love a simpler way to build better soil. And tell me in the comments, have you tried vermicomposting before, or are you ready to start your first worm tower now? Until next time, keep digging, keep observing, and keep finding the earthly delights in your own backyard. Bye for now.